Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us each week to update us on the latest events in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on the current situation in Israel for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel, and Happy New Year to everybody. The last week or so in Israel, we're coming up to 90 days. Tomorrow will be the 90th day of the war. And it's clear that the signs are that Israel is moving further and further south. But what is also happening as it moves further south, it doesn't need as many troops in the north of the Gaza Strip. And over the last week or so, some of the soldiers who are called up in the reserves have been released because, as I said, when you're trying to take over as much territory as possible, you need a very large fighting force, but just to hold it or, make sure that Hamas or militant groups, terrorist groups do not return, requires a much smaller force. And there is talk in Israel that is moving to something, what is being described as phase 3 of the fighting, which will be a lot more targeted with, as I said, a lot less forces. We're still not there yet. It's clear that the fighting forces are moving further and further south, capturing as much territory as possible, trying to squeeze the Hamas terrorist infrastructure as much as possible. According to Israeli sources, Israel has already killed over 8,500 terrorists, Hamas terrorists, during this war. So it is making, inroads into the not just into the bodies and soldiers of the Hamas terrorists, but also the Hamas infrastructure. We know that Sinwar's headquarters have been taken, and much of the underground tunnel infrastructure has already been taken and subsequently destroyed, but there's clearly quite a lot to go. But the war is certainly edging closer and closer to the third stage, something which the Americans are very keen to start as soon as possible. They don't like the death toll that is being reported by the Ministry of Health, the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, which clearly, if you look at the numbers, is not telling the whole story and is probably exaggerating much of the numbers. According to that same Hamas-run Ministry of Health, the majority of people who have been killed are women and children, and that's clearly not the case. But it is something which is causing concern in America and Washington and many other places. And there is a lot more pressure on Israel to try and scale back some of its more aggressive movements that it's basically done over the last few dozen days since pretty much the early days of the war. And again, sort of more pinpointed attacks with the smaller forces in Gaza and try and let as many Gazans back to their homes. Although a lot of the cities and towns and villages have been destroyed, but not full cities, obviously, but certain parts, especially where Hamas were using and firing from and had their headquarters. So Israel is looking to try and see how it can, on the one hand, appease this sentiment, but on the other hand, really try and go after Hamas as soon as possible. Obviously, there's really only one place to start today, which basically the major event of yesterday and the last week was the assassination of Salah al-Arouri, who was the number 2 in the military wing of Hamas. He's just below Ismail Haniyeh. He is a Hamas terrorist leader who was there right from the beginning. And he has moved between Qatar, Turkey, and Lebanon, thinking that he was safe in the Dakhia neighborhood, which is the neighborhood of Beirut, which is pretty much controlled by Hezbollah. And the fact that he was killed in the Beirut neighborhood under the noses of Hezbollah and Nasrallah is really a major achievement. I should say at this point that Israel has not taken responsibility. Like always, there have been hints. Mossad director David Barnea came out today and didn't accept responsibility, but said, sort of hinted very much towards it. And obviously the working opinion in Hamas and Hezbollah and others is that Israel is behind it. But it is a major assassination. It is one of the top levels, probably for sure the highest level leader of Hamas that's been killed to date during this war. And the fact that it took place under Nasrallah's nose is really quite something. Nasrallah came out tonight with one of his major speeches. As usual, it was well over an hour. A lot of the usual propaganda that Israel is hiding all the thousands, tens of thousands of casualties, and hundreds of thousands of Israelis have left Israel in the last couple of months. It's the beginning of the war, and the Arab side is winning, etc., etc. But interestingly enough, what he did say is that he will not be dragged. Hezbollah will not be dragged into a war. And the question is, why is Nasrallah not really, going full tilt on this? Because at the end of the day, Nasrallah, as well as being an Iranian proxy, he is still a part of the Lebanese political infrastructure, and he does have to care about Lebanese sentiment. And Lebanese sentiment isn't as strong on a Palestinian leader as it is on what would be a Lebanese leader. As we know, Palestinians are considered second-class citizens in Lebanon, in the refugee camps. In Lebanon, they have curfews. They're not allowed to work in certain jobs. They're not allowed to marry. They're not well regarded. They're not considered on the same level as Lebanon. And also, there's been a lot of threats, some from Nasrallah's allies and some from his opponents within Lebanese politics, basically not calling on Nasrallah not to drag Lebanon into a war. They see very clearly what's going on in Gaza. They understand Israel's power, its air superiority, even though Hezbollah is a real threat. It is a fully functioning army with major ballistic missile capability. It's still really no match for the IDF, and a lot of people in Lebanon are very worried about it. So Nasrallah has to take that into account. So that's why his sort of veiled threat that Hezbollah will respond, but it will be at their time, their watch, and clearly anything that happens in the near future, they'll say that it's as a result of that assassination. But the fact that he's not going gung-ho into some response shows that, again, as we've spoken about in recent weeks, there still has not been that final order from Tehran to go full tilt into war. And Nasrallah is very cognizant, not just of that, but also of the Lebanese political and domestic feeling. Another thing that happened today is South Africa applied or called for an investigation into genocide by the State of Israel. This is a major diplomatic threat to Israel, and Israel is considering its response. We'll have to wait to see what exactly happens. Will there be an interim call for an investigation? Israel is following this very carefully. It's a long report by South Africa, mostly conjecture and attacks without really much validity. But the thing that they're most worried about in Israel is that there is an addendum or appendix or what have you to the report, which basically catalogues some comments made by Israeli politicians at the beginning and the duration of the war. And again, the overwhelming majority of these comments are by mid to low level politicians, certainly not decision makers, and really are not effective of where Israel has been fighting this war. But as we know in Israel, every politician likes to get headlines. Every politician likes to, jump over the next one to see how more militant they can be. And the South Africans have been quite clever. And it's not just South Africa. We know very well that most of the information was provided by foreign sources in the Arab and Muslim world, but they've certainly been cataloging these speeches and these comments, and they're trying to use that try and justify their case against Israel in The Hague. On the hostage deal, it's very unclear what is happening at this point. According to Hamas, publicly at least, they are still sticking to the line that no hostage deal is even that there's no negotiations until the war has finished and Israel has withdrawn from the Strip. That's the official line. But what clearly is happening is something else. Again, nothing drastic is moving in a positive direction, but the fact that there are negotiations, the fact that the Qataris are involved, and most importantly, from an Israeli point of view, the Qataris have not come out and condemned the assassination, as of now at least, of al-Aruri, which leads some in Israel to optimism that negotiations will not be stymied by the assassination, and in fact will still be ongoing. There is a feeling in Israel that Sinwar is starting to walk back this maximalist demand and is prepared, perhaps because of the assassination, perhaps because Israel is pushing further into the south, but there is some cause for optimism that talks could continue at some point soon. Again, there are no great signs that negotiations are seriously happening, but the fact is that there have been proposals by the Qataris and by Egypt, which were rejected by Hamas, but clearly not completely, because the negotiators are still in town and still trying to work out some deal. On the domestic front, there's been a real sort of earthquake on the judicial front, with two major rulings that one would think perhaps in the middle of a war are either not necessary or could have waited until after the war, but I'll explain why they came about. We talked a lot before the war about the reasonableness clause that the government passed a basic law. I should say the coalition rather passed a basic law which would deprive the Supreme Court of using the reasonableness clause as opposed to an actual, a contravention of a law in its ruling against appointments and laws themselves, etc. Up until now, as we know, basic laws were pretty much impregnable to Supreme Court, and there was a feeling that this would really be, unprecedented if they did strike down this change of the basic law, and so it was. There was a ruling. It was a 15-member bench, if we remember, the full Supreme Court bench, and there was a ruling, a very, very close ruling, 8-7, in favor of striking it down. Now, not only was it unprecedented in the fact that this is the first time the Supreme Court has ruled that a basic law can be annulled, but what was also interesting, and I think this was even, I think there was 11-4, that basically ruled that a basic law can be struck down by the Supreme Court. So what's interesting is that there were some who said that this particular law amendment should not be struck down, in other words, in opposition to the final ruling, but did admit in their own personal rulings that it is the business of the Supreme Court. It can look at basic laws and it can strike them down, which certainly is perhaps even more worrying for this particular coalition than the final ruling, because what we see is the reason for the rulings basically now, and I'll talk about the second ruling in a minute. The reason is because the Supreme Court President Esther Hayut has just finished her tenure, and according to the law, you're allowed to give a ruling within 3 months of your retirement, and that was in the middle of January, would have been the end of the 3-month period after she resigned. So it's clear that she wanted to get this decision out before she retired. And there's another person also on the Supreme Court bench, another justice who's also retiring at the same time. And the two that are replacing are more from the conservative wing. So it would have tilted the balance. At the moment, it's more towards the progressive liberal side, and it would tilted more towards the conservative side. So there was a feeling that Supreme Court Justice President Esther Hayut really wanted to try and get ahead of the ruling, ahead of the change in the bench, and get the rulings out. The second one is to strike down the recusal law, or not really to strike down, but basically the recusal law deprives the Attorney General of recusing the Prime Minister because of a conflict of interest. This is something which was much discussed over the last year before the war, and the coalition decided to create a law against it. This was considered unfit. It was considered a personal law. In other words, it was written specifically with one person in mind. In other words, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it wasn't struck down necessarily, the law, but what the bench did decide, and this was a smaller bench, but again, I think it was 6-5 on an 11-seat bench, that it can only come in to law after the next elections during the next Knesset. In other words, it shouldn't be used at this point with this particular coalition. So that was two really remarkable decisions, not wholly unexpected, but the fact that they took place within war was something that obviously the coalition jumped on. There was some commentary that said that the government could have extended the tenure, or at least the leaving that three-month period to another 3 months, to make it a 6-month period where retiring Supreme Court justices could have still given their ruling. That was not done. So the fact is that the Chayut decided to do this now before she ran out of time. But what it has done is it's really brought those divisions back into focus. As one can imagine, the coalition, especially the Likud Party and Religious Zionist Party, has come out against these decisions, and the opposition has come out in support, and it's really bringing back to a certain extent those dividing lines that we saw before the war, at really a time where there's great unity and there's a need for great unity in the middle of a war. So it'll be interesting to see how much noise these make. We're still in the reverberations of those decisions, but we'll have to see how long that will continue. Finally, we've been hearing quite a lot how the calls for resignation of Netanyahu and perhaps others in the senior political, security and intelligence realms have been met with the retort that you don't change leadership in the middle of war. Well, this week we actually did see a change of leadership. We saw the rotation, as we know, under the rotation agreement. Foreign Minister Eli Cohen will then be replaced by Yisrael Katz. Yisrael Katz has been foreign minister for about 15 months in the past, so he's no stranger to the ministry. But again, this was a moment that was not unnoticed by those who were dismissed, or dismissed by those who basically said that you don't change leadership in war. And the fact that the foreign minister, one of the most senior positions in the Israeli government, was switched because of political considerations, as I said, did not go unnoticed. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much. The first question that came in before we even started this webinar from an anonymous: any conditions short of a no confidence vote in the Knesset that would enable Israel to go to elections, short of the specified fixed mandated time that is some months, if not years off?
Yeah, I mean, the other possibility is if a budget doesn't pass, but the budget's been passed till the end of 2024, even though there are some amendments. So it would have to, the government would only fall 3 months after that. So we're talking about at the end of March 2025. So that's the other alternative at this point. Obviously, if someone resigns and calls for early elections, but that would necessitate, a law to pass calling for elections, which isn't likely to happen. And no confidence is certainly not going to happen at this particular point, although there are always murmurings that some Likud rebels, at least keeping it in their back pocket in case of emergency, as it were. But yeah, it's certainly not in the offing, and there are very limited opportunities to call for elections, especially now. And we did see this week municipal elections were pushed back once again to the end of February. I mean, that's largely because a lot of people standing for elections are still in Gaza and in the reserves. And it was felt that we couldn't hold municipal elections during a war when so many people are still fighting. Again, there was quite a lot of controversy and fighting between the ultra-Orthodox parties, some other parties in the coalition, because as we know, much smaller percentage of ultra-Orthodox community are, on the front lines and unable to campaign and vote, etc. But that did get sorted out. The will of the country, frankly, won out on that, and the ultra-Orthodox parties understood that. So the fact that municipal elections have been put back, there's very little justification at this point to go through general elections, especially when there seems to be very few tools to do so.
Thank you. Adam Perry asks, what is the genuine diplomatic benefit to South Africa for producing their report? How will this impact overall African relationships with Israel?
Well, on the second part, it doesn't really impact the wider continent. South Africa have for many years, especially if we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, have really been an outlier of real anti-Israel hostility. I mean, they've removed their ambassador a long time ago. They basically, call Israel a Nazi regime. I think some of the comments that came out. I mean, the relationship has been very, very bad for quite a while. It doesn't necessarily affect Israel's relationship with the wider continent. And in fact, when Israel tried to return to an observer status earlier in the year, South Africa and some of the North African Arab countries came out very strongly against, but they actually lost out because there was enough support around the rest of the continent for Israel, and Israel has been making very strong inroads in support in Africa and West Africa and in East Africa and even central and southern parts. But South Africa is a real outlier, partly because of its history, partly because of its demographics. It has an extremely high Muslim population. And in fact, the one area, if you look at the internal politics of South Africa, I think it's the Western Cape, which is the one area the ANC does not rule, is actually the highest percentage of Muslim voters. So it's very much pandering to that for purely domestic reasons. But it certainly can be a bloody nose diplomatically if they do get a ruling. If for some reason at the end of this that Israel is charged or accused of genocide, it won't necessarily have too much application under international law, but it will certainly be just another weapon that will be wielded by those who want to damage Israel's name to then be able to use this ruling, as a previous ICJ ruling against Israel's anti-terrorism barrier was basically, the ICJ ruled that it was unnecessary, and it was, I think they even called it an apartheid barrier or whatever it is, using the language of Israel's enemies. It didn't have any bearing on the ground, legally, physically, or anything, but it is a ruling that is still used by Israel's enemies around the world. So if they were to successfully accuse Israel of genocide, one can imagine the effect that would have on the discourse around Israel around the world.
Absolutely. Thank you. Brock Korkmaz asks, which Israel is real? Is it Ben-Gur's Israel with the idea of Gaza occupation and exile of the Gazans, or IDF's Israel, which insists that Israel is conducting war against Hamas, not the Gazans? Can you comment on this dilemma, please?
Did you say Ben-Gurion or Ben-Gvir at the beginning?
Ben-Gvir.
I think he meant, I'm assuming he meant Ben-Gvir.
Yes, that's
okay.
Right.
At the end of the day, the people who make the decisions in time of war, at least, is the war cabinet, and that's basically one that Netanyahu holds very, very tightly. Ben-Gvir very much, and Bezalel Smotrich, his partner, have been, very much sort of shouting from the outside. They are part of the security cabinet, but the major decisions are made in the war cabinet, where they are not part of. They're desperately trying to become part of it, but Netanyahu will not let them in. Absolutely. And so the decisions are made by Netanyahu in a very small circle of people around him. And that's the way that, they're the ones who are really going to decide on the day after. Obviously, Netanyahu has to take into account coalition interests, personal interests, party interests. There are a lot of people in Likud who will be far closer to some of the suggestions of Ben Gvir and Smotrich than they will be of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is certainly not a particular popular character in the Likud. I mean, his approval rating is rock bottom anyway in the country. But the ideas that have been proposed by Smotrich and Ben Gvir are not going to be voted on in the war cabinet, are probably not even going to be discussed in any serious manner. So it is going to be very much Netanyahu's decision on what happens to the Gaza Strip after the war. There were supposed to be these discussions, and there was supposed to be a meeting yesterday, but the assassination really put pay to that. So it's going to be put off for at least another couple of days.
Thank you. So an anonymous attendee asks, is the risk of escalation with Hezbollah rising in recent events? It has seemed that Iran's proxies, aside from Hamas itself, have been deterred from escalating the conflict. But is that containment shifting in any important way now?
It's still there currently. The assassination, I mean, it's still the early hours after the assassination, so things could change. Basically, the equation has been that while there is this sort of contained, I wouldn't say war, but sort of battle between Hezbollah and Israel on the northern border, hasn't really come into a fully fledged war because there doesn't seem to be an interest from either party to do so. But what is coming into sharp focus is that the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have been removed by their own government from the northern border will not go back unless Hezbollah have been completely deterred. Now, there's a lot of talk in Israel and around the international community about resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was passed at the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006. And basically, what that says is that there should be no armed militias, in other words, Hezbollah, south of the Litani River, which is a river demarcating the sort of south of Lebanon. But a lot of Israelis are come to the conclusion that even if some diplomatic solution did work out, Amos Hochstein, who is the US envoy, who's landing in Lebanon tomorrow to discuss these issues, even if a diplomatic solution succeeded, and Hezbollah in some way looked like they were removing themselves, what would be, and the war, the war would finish in Gaza and the war would finish in the north, what would be stopping Hezbollah 1 month, 2 months, 6 months later from just simply traveling south under the guise of civilians, which is what they've done before, going back to their underground bunkers and what have you. So there are a lot of people in Israel who say that Hezbollah at one point have to be taken on militarily. There's no other way around it. And this is as good a time as any to do so, because it just won't have the leverage or the ability to strike in any meaningful way, further down the line.
Thank you. Eric Selkov asks, when we look at the major goals of Israel, 1, eliminating Hamas leadership, 2, making Hamas unable to attack Israel, 3, making sure Hamas cannot regain power, and of course, returning the hostages. Where do you think Israel is in achieving these goals?
Well, certainly Hamas's missile capabilities weakening. I mean, from the early days of the war, where they were shooting multiple times, across the country every day, to once or twice a week, sometimes less, sometimes more. Part of it is because they're just shooting off rockets before Israel conquers that particular territory, but also because their missile ability is weakening. A lot of its missile abilities, especially the longer range ones, were in the north, which would make sense because it's obviously closer to Israel's center. So it's clearly defeating Hamas's ability to strike at Israel from a rocket point of view. And its military command, Hamas's military command, has been severely disrupted. As I said, Israel has conquered much of its headquarters and its military infrastructure. So it's certainly on the way to defeating Hamas. Whether it can completely defeat Hamas, whether it will completely defeat Hamas to the last man, whether it will be able to take out people like Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and some of the other leaders, that remains to be seen. Depending who you speak to, some are confident that they will be, targeted. Now there's even talk, and Netanyahu apparently behind closed doors even admitted in a meeting that was supposed to be off record with the Hostages Forum, that there could be some talk of allowing the senior Hamas leaders to leave if the hostages were released. It's the first time that that was admitted, that there was even thoughts in that direction. So that is certainly, that was something pounced on by the media and many of the government's opponents. But certainly the one that's sort of holding firm at this point and doesn't seem to be too much movement is the hostages. But that is a real, that's a more difficult one to approach, because you need a lot of things. Some say that you need to take your foot off the gas militarily. Some say you need to push full tilt on that to put pressure. Sinwar only made the first deal because he felt the Israeli boot on his neck. That's what a lot of people are saying. And he just simply doesn't feel that at the moment, because Israel is allowing as much humanitarian aid in almost as was during that deal. So there's no real leverage with Sinwar, who seems to be the person pulling the strings. So that doesn't seem to. There seems to be, as I said, some optimism within Israel, but it doesn't seem to be moving, particularly in a speedy fashion. But the other goals are on their way. But sometimes the most difficult part of wars are the final moments, and we're far from the final moments. But certainly on the ground, the battle is going, in Israel's favor, and it is moving further and further south. So it remains to be seen to what point Israel, goes and at what point it feels that it's done enough, achieved enough, and then moves on to the next phase.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please note there will be no webinar this Friday, January 5th. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.